But then you would have to change the
yeah,
time
but
period.
all substantial but right now, if you evaluate a substantial hazard the way we currently do.
Yeah, you're doing it way down.
That's right.
You're right,
Because
but
you see them.
those don't trigger an immediate
Right. Well,
response. So you don't
Yeah.
you don't want to lose. I mean,
So-
assuming you don't want to lose what you've got now in the world of substantial hazard.
That's why I'm wondering if
Still-
we need a
it's
new,
still-
if we need a new term.
let's back up for a second. Right now, a lot of things that would be, like, you don't do a substantial hazard evaluation until you get to a temporary solution or RLS.
Right.
But there are things that right now, because of the way the reg is written, would be an imminent hazard. If you had a short 5-year risk for exposure to arsenic in soil that was above the cap, that's right now called an imminent hazard.
Right.
If you did a substantial hazard evaluation, which you're not doing, it would also be a substantial hazard because they're the same thing. There is no difference in the risk number that you would calculate. You're just calling it
Right.
different things.
So I kind of look at the substantial hazard category is kind of underperforming right now.
Yeah, it's not doing anything, yeah.
You know, it's
Jazz it up.
carved out in chapter 21E and in the regs as something that poses significant risk if it were to exist for several years, which
Right.
kind of jives with what I'm thinking for these, like arsenic in soil, let's say.
Right.
Kind of exposure. And right now, currently, you really only use substantial hazards to determine is it a permanent solution or a temporary?
Right.
Yeah. So I view that as kind of underperforming, that it almost becomes an afterthought.
That's right.
Whereas I think what you're going, if we were to take these kinds of exposures out of the imminent hazard category because it doesn't fit, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say acute, but let's say acute for that short-term exposure.
Yeah.
Then
5 years is not.
then it categorizes it as, you know, these things shouldn't be evaluated for imminent hazards because that 5-year exposure is not an imminent hazard condition. It's more of a substantial hazard condition. So one thing would be redefining kind of, and that would be kind of redefining and reworking our guidance for calculating risk and what we described, kind of when you do it and where you do it. That's more of a policy and guidance change. But what would be required in regulation would be, okay, now that it's a substantial hazard, what do we want you to do about it? What should the department do about it? What should the regulating community do about it?
That's right.
Do we want to hear about it sooner? Right now, we don't hear about
Right.
substantial hazards sooner.
Like a notification.
What would
to an
be
evaluation.
required?
Yeah.
You know, a notification requirement for if you have a substantial hazard, notify the department.
Yep.
The question would be, well, do we want to hear about that in 2 hours? Do we want to hear about it in 72 hours? Do we want to hear about it in 120 days? Do we want a new reporting condition? How much do we, you know, where would that fit in? And then what does it trigger? So those are,
But I mean, I'm just,
it's all on the
right,
head.
I'm just like thinking
Yeah.
out loud that you're
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about like a substantial hazard and how does that trigger a new notification? I mean, one of the challenges of that is you actually have to do the substantial hazard evaluation.
And base it on something.
Before, and base it on something.
Right.
Before you do that.
But you're doing,
But there are also, I mean, there are even, you know, some imminent hazards that I don't think, you know, that get probably evaluated and notified, which is, and you guys can correct me on this or refine it, on when the IH for lead was reduced to 1.
Well, because of CNS effects, yeah.
Well, I don't really know
Yeah.
why, but
That's fine.
Yeah,
okay. But if you actually did a calculation on most lead concentrations at most sites, you would be triggering an IH on that.
If it was in superficial soil and it was
Right,
in
and I don't-
soil and, yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
That is very rarely done.
And there's a
Yeah.
question
I
of
mean,
what
honestly.
toxicity value you use.
Right.
So
Let's put lead aside because that's,
Right.
and
And
we
it's a
can
whole
derail.
range.
Right,
Yeah.
and I wasn't bringing it up to discuss the details of it, I was just using it as an example, which I don't think that evaluation is done on a frequent basis. So I'm kind of sitting on your side of the table, Paul, that if you're relying on a risk calculation for a substantial hazard and then you're getting notification, you may not get notification and that evaluation done in the time frame that the department probably thinks need to be looked at. So that's what you've got. That's kind of the downside of not having kind of just clear-cut numbers.
Okay, hold that thought about clear-cut numbers.
Yes.
All right, and
I
I don't know what I'm advocating for, I haven't thought that out. But I'm just trying to, like I said, throw the issues on the table.
40.0321.
Yeah.
Let's
Put it
cut
in.
it.
Put it in development.
I just had a question, just to kind of follow on that. So if there were a notification requirement in the regs that said, if you have a substantial hazard at your site, you have to notify within X, and then a substantial hazard was identified in some risk assessment way, defined in some risk assessment way, you're saying that would still not get you notification in, when we would want it in, as soon as we would want it in? Is
I don't
that?
know. I'm saying that's an uncertainty. It would get you notification when it was done. I don't know when it would be done.
When it would be done?
But couldn't you have set
I guess my
default
question-
But that's a
value?
problem right now.
Right,
That's a problem right now.
Right, so we're trying to,
Couldn't you develop a set of default concentrations? I mean, there are some imminent hazards, where you have certain metals and surface soils. Couldn't you come up with a set of substantial hazard concentrations, whether it's air or soil, and if you meet these, you're in?
Well,
You know right away.
I think two things kind of along those lines. One is, and I may be oversimplifying it, that part, and I'm trying to simplify it, I'm trying to keep it simple. Part of the way I look at this is that we're taking what we're doing now, so these new substantial hazard evaluations would be, for carcinogens, would be identical to the imminent hazard evaluation
Right.
for carcinogens that we do now.
right.
So, just looking at it in terms of the resources needed and the expertise needed and the spreadsheets that are needed and the toxicological information that's needed, nothing will change except for the terminology and perhaps timing of notification.
And
Yes.
response
I actually have a
act.
thought.
So, okay,
Well, you can finish first.
so that's in that simplified view of the world, I think collectively our ability to deal with kind of looking at imminent and substantial hazards at the same point of time in the same way that we currently look at imminent hazards.
Right.
I think would be, I would hope, and again, it's probably for simplification, would be really kind of training ourselves to talk about in terms of imminent and substantial hazards. And that would kind of hopefully trigger that evaluation.
Okay. Now I
Thought.
now I have a thought that pushes back on what you just said, but follows up my comment about when is this done and when you're notified. I get if we talk about, Lisa's language with acute is kind of like imminent now, and that's fine. I understand we really want to be notified and address the things that really, really, really matter.
I'm thinking TCE.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I get
yeah.
that,
Well,
I get
that's-
that,
yeah.
okay, but if we're now saying that, 5 years isn't really an imminent hazard, doesn't have, why can't this new substantial hazard evaluation be wrapped into phase 2? Because if that's completed within 3 to 4 years, whatever the window gives you, that's when you have to do a risk assessment.
So the reason.
And when you do the risk assessment,
Right.
I mean, obviously, if you had a substantial hazard, you're not gonna get to NSR. So, I mean, it's at that point.
The reason
How's that
why,
different than risk?
the reason why
Well,
is,
that you're doing a risk assessment then too.
right, but the reason why you don't want to wait till the phase 2 is if, say, you have a risk for children exposed to something in soil that
Right.
poses a cancer risk of 8 to the -4. or I don't know, some number that's well above the risk limit. The reason you may not want to wait till phase 2 is that if it's a current exposure, you may not want to wait 4 years to address it. So that's the reason for having a notification and a requirement earlier and requiring you to do. So right now, those things, those exposures should, and part of your comment is they may not always, but they should be identified from under 40.0321, which requires people to do an imminent hazard evaluation. So that's the reason for wanting to know about it sooner, is so that if there is a current unacceptable risk, that it is addressed while phase 2 is going, while investigation activities are going on, and not
But then you